Welcome back to the A&P lab. Today we're going to work on laboratory exercise 12, bone structure. Okay, what we have laying on the table here is a femur bone. It is a real bone, and we are going to look at the structure of that femur. Now that bone is longer than it is wide, so it's classified as a long bone. But on this hand model here, even the smallest of these is still longer than it is wide, so those are considered long bones also. In the wrist here, these are called carpals, and you'll learn that. They're about equal in width and length, so they're called short bones. And long bones, short bones, the carpals and some of the tarsals. A sesamoid bone, a round bone, and irregular bone. Okay, let's go over the structures on this femur or this long bone. Now we use some directional terms in lab exercise 2, and some of the directional terms will help us in naming the parts. Now this is the head of the femur, and the head of the femur articulates at the hip. It's that depression in the hip is called the acetabulum, and it articulates with the head of the femur. Now, since this is closest to the trunk, we could use that term, that relative position term, of proximal. So this area of the bone, this end of the bone, is called the proximal end. So the opposite, closest to the knee, would be the distal end. Okay, now let's take it a step further. The ends of a long bone are called epiphysi. That's plural. Epiphysis, singular. So this is the epiphysis. This is in particular the proximal epiphysis. Proximal epiphysis because it's closest to the trunk of the body, as compared to the distal epiphysis, which is a distance away from the trunk, distal epiphysis. Okay, now the shaft of the bone is called the diathesis. The diathesis of the bone, the epiphysis and epiphysis, proximal epiphysis, the distal epiphysis. Okay, those are the parts of the bone. Well, let's look to see some other parts of the bone. Now we have a cross section of a bone, so we're going to use these two things to name the different parts of this femur. Okay, when we do a sagittal section of this femur, we can see inside. Right here you can see where we have compact bone, where the cells in the matrix are tightly packed. There's non-living matrix there, it's tightly packed, and that's called compact bone, and this is called spongy bone. Okay, spongy bone, compact bone. This is compact bone, and inside here is spongy bone. Okay, this is articular surface. What that means is that it articulates in a joint, so it's called an articular surface. As we have a cross section of this bone, I told you this was spongy bone, and this is compact bone. Now look here, and you can see the compact bone, and you can see a cavity there. That is called the medullary cavity. As you were labeling your lab manual, you labeled that as a medullary cavity. Okay, with compact bone, medullary cavity. Now there is a little bit of spongy bone lining that medullary cavity and making a crisscross pattern that makes that spongy bone. Okay, now as the bone is growing in a young person, in a child, there's going to be red marrow here. But in the bone of an adult, there is yellow marrow in the in the medullary cavity. Yellow marrow is responsible for fat storage. Okay, so we need a way to store excess adipose tissue, so that's where it's stored, is in that yellow marrow. Now that's in the medullary cavity. In the spongy bone, there's going to be red marrow. Okay, marrow is what, if you eat fried chicken or any kind of chicken and it has the bone left in it, like a chicken leg bone, if you've ever broken it apart, you can see the marrow inside. Now if it's cooked, it's going to be a dark color, but if it weren't cooked, you would see the red marrow inside of it. Now in adults, again, yellow marrow is found in the medullary cavity, red marrow in the spongy bone. Okay. Now let's look at the bone model, and then we'll come back to this and name a couple of more parts. Just a minute ago we looked at that sagittal and cross section of a long bone, and now let's look at those structures, same structures on this model. Now this represents the medullary cavity, and in that medullary cavity you have spongy bone. Okay? Now this represents the compact bone. Okay? Spongy bone looks just like that. It's got plates of bone that crisscross and all, and gives it that spongy look. So compact bone, spongy bone of the medullary cavity. Now you see raised areas on this model. When this bone is ossifying, this bone starts out as cartilage, and then one layer, then you have a blood vessel that runs through this canal right here, and one layer of bone after the next will ossify in place of that cartilage, and these structures develop called osteons, these concentric circles. And I'm going to turn this over to the side so you can see those concentric circles. That's called an osteon. This is a raised osteon, just the model has them raised so that you can see the different osteons. And in the center of the osteon is the central canal. Some books call it the osteonic canal, or central canal is all you need to remember. Okay? And then in that central canal you're going to have blood vessels, nerves and stuff. So you have nerves. So this tissue is innervated and vascular, nerves and blood vessels. Okay, it needs blood vessels because it needs the nourishment that comes from the blood to go to these living cells, a process called diffusion, the moving of substance from an area of higher concentration in that blood to an area of lower concentration in that living cell. So your bone, a part of the bone, is living. Then there's non-living matrix that surrounds these living cells, and so whatever that cell needs has to come to the cell by the process of diffusion from the blood. Concentric circles make up an osteon. So if I had a piece of tape from here to here and asked you what that structure was, or what this structure is, or what this structure is, those would be osteons. That would be a central canal. Okay, so we know that, okay, this is the way this is. Okay? This is the long part of the bone that we're seeing here. Alright, so we know that blood vessels run up and down, but we also need blood vessels going across, so they're interconnected with one another. They're interconnected with each other by the transverse canal. The transverse canal. So central canal and then transverse, one of those directional terms again, transverse canal, connecting these blood vessels so they're all interconnected and can keep that tissue with those living cells embedded in the non-living matrix nourished, and also get rid of the waste products when those cells metabolize, from when they metabolize. Now those cells, because it is bone, It is called an osteocyte. The osteocyte is the mature bone cell. And so that it sort of looks like a little spider or a tick. And I've had students who couldn't remember the name of osteocyte, so they put spider or tick. No, it just looks like that, but that's not what it is. Because these cells have these cytoplasmic extensions that go into these little canals, these little troughs, so that it increases the surface area and allows for the substances to diffuse to it, and all those little cytoplasmic extensions can pick up what that cell needs to live. Okay? Those little canal, it's actually called Canaliculus. Okay, so these sort of represent the Canaliculus. All these little bitty lines there, these little lines there, are little canals where things can diffuse to that living osteocyte, Canaliculus. With the protoplasmic extensions, that's just an extension from the cell into that canal so it can pick up what it needs. So we have blood vessels and nerves that run through the medullary cavity, through the central canals, and transverse canals are also called perforating canals. So a book that you might be reading may call that a perforating canal or transverse canal. Alright, now this is compact bone. On the outside and on the inside of this bone, there is a connective tissue that covers it. That connective tissue on the outside of the bone, on this part of the bone, will be periosteum. Periosteum, connective tissue that lines the outside of the bone. On the inside of the bone, where you have the spongy bone in the medullary cavity, that's called endosteum. Endosteum, endo, within. Peri means around, and in this case around the outside, but endosteum lines the medullary cavity. Now, you're going to have periosteum all over the outside of the bone except in one place. Okay, this is the head of the femur, and we said this articulates with acetabulum in the hip. Okay, at the hip. So wherever it articulates with another bone, it has hyaline cartilage. It has cartilage on it to help it stay smooth and articulate smoothly. It has cartilage. So there's periosteum on this bone everywhere except where there is articular cartilage or hyaline cartilage. Articular cartilage. Okay, this articulates with the hip. This articulates with the knee, with the tibia. The femur articulates with articulates with a pad of cartilage called the meniscus, and then on the other side of that, lower than that, is going to be the tibia. But this articulates, so it's going to have articular cartilage. Articular cartilage. So as you get older and that cartilage wears down, or you have injury to it, wherever the cartilage wears off and you have bone exposed, it does not have periosteum, so it can break down even faster, because where you have articular cartilage, you do not have periosteum, and periosteum helps to keep that bone strong. Okay, so periosteum, no periosteum, because there's articular cartilage. Periosteum, but no periosteum, because there's articular cartilage. Okay, let's see. And that periosteum that lines the outside of this bone is a dense connective tissue. So the outside of the bone, periosteum, the medullary cavity, endosteum. Now, you can even see, this again is a real bone and it's been chipped there. You can see part of that spongy bone. And I said spongy bone has red marrow, but I think I neglected to tell you what the function of the red marrow is. Red marrow is responsible for producing red blood cells. So, blood cell production in the red marrow in the spongy bone.